Welcome to the Revealed Podcast, where your stories are revealed and God is revealed in your story. You'll hear stories from people who are connected to the Red Hills region of Southwest Georgia. The people who share come from all walks of life. They're male and female, and they have different backgrounds. Some stories will leave you wondering how the storyteller ever survived. Others are simple but will touch your heart. We hope the stories that you hear encourage you in your own walk. And my name is Angie Durham, and I'm your host. Today, I'm talking with Elizabeth Mitchum. And Elizabeth is the Director of Christian Education at First Presbyterian Church in Thomasville, Georgia. Now, Elizabeth, one of the things that I absolutely love about you is I just think of you as being the quintessential Southern lady. I love the way you talk, I love your mannerisms, and I love your cooking.
Thank you. That's quite a compliment.
Whenever we have a potluck, I always like to know what you've brought. And by the way, I tried to bake your cowboy cookies, and mine did not taste anywhere as good as yours did.
Well, I'll bake you sometime.
Well, I appreciate that. I think anybody who's been listening to the podcast at this point knows that I like asking questions about food. I like talking about food because I like food.
That's right. I'm with you on that, Angie.
Well, let's find out a little bit about you. With that Southern accent, I know you're from somewhere in the South, but you're not originally from Thomasville. So tell me a little bit about where you grew up.
That's right. I'm originally from Perry, Georgia. That's in the center of the state, about 125 miles north of Thomasville. My family moved there just before I turned 5 years old, and my dad had a long career in civilian service at Robins Air Force Base and also in military service within the Air Force Reserve.
So y'all didn't move around a lot with his career, or?
We did not. We were really fortunate. Prior to coming to Middle Georgia, my dad had served active duty in the Army, and then he was honorably discharged from the Army, went into civilian service, and he was able to stay put in one of Robins in Middle Georgia. My parents have now been there 52 years. And so we were fortunate to be raised in just a really stereotypical Southern small town.
And do you have siblings?
I do. I have one sister, Susanna. She's 2 years younger than I am, and she and her husband live in Huntsville, Alabama, and she has 2 grown children.
And I know you're the mom to 2 daughters,
right,
who are now 29 and 26 years old.
Yes.
And yes. Where do they live?
Lauren is my older daughter. She is in Athens. She is a proud graduate of the University of Georgia and has never left Athens. She now works for the university as an academic advisor. And Claire is also a UGA graduate and a graduate of Washington and Lee Law School, and she is an attorney in Charleston.
Do you ever get a chance to visit them?
Fortunately, just last weekend, Tim, my husband, and I met up with my parents in Charleston. We got a Airbnb there, and then we were able to spend time with Lauren and Claire and Claire's friend Daniel.
It must be fun when they get older like that, to have times like that when you can just spend time together and be adults together.
Yes, it's a lot of fun. I've always brought up to Sunday school classes and ladies groups the last few years that parenting adult children comes with its own challenges, but it is very rewarding, and to see where they are in their lives and to learn to respect them as adults.
Yes. Well, as you know, I like to ask really random questions because people like to know random stuff about us.
Sure.
So here is your random question, Elizabeth. What historical time period would you most like to visit?
Ooh, that is, there's so many that are of interest to me, but I would have to say 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel in the Holy Land with my dad and my sister. And I could just envision being there with Jesus. And I would just, although that was a very different time culturally for women, I'm not sure if my modern day self would enjoy some aspects of it, but I would love to have seen him in his daily life.
Oh, I love that. That's really neat. And that must have been an incredible trip to go on with your dad and your sister.
It absolutely was. It was a trip of a lifetime. It's a really sweet story that my grandmother, my dad's mother, lived to be 93. And when she passed away, she, as part of her inheritance, she told my dad, I never got to go to the Holy Land. I want you to take that trip someday. So that was just such a gift to us. And this was a woman who read her Bible every single day. I've forgotten the number of times she read from Genesis to Revelation, but that was such a desire of hers that she got to share with us.
Yeah. And I love that too, because when I was thinking, I knew I was going to ask you this question before we got here, and I was thinking, I'd like to live during the time of Downton Abbey because I really liked their clothes.
Yes.
So here you are focusing on something spiritual, and I'm totally just focusing on what people wore and wanting to wear some of those dresses.
I do think that trip really changed my perspective, but I'm with you. I love the culture of that particular era.
Well, tell me, how in the world did you end up in Thomasville?
Well, it's a really interesting story because not only was I raised in Perry, I raised my children there too. So after college, I came back to Perry, and like I said, my girls graduated from the same high school that I graduated from. But in the early 2000s, 2002, or I'm sorry, a little bit later than that, 2007, I went through a painful divorce, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. And my girls were high school age. And of course, I was very committed to my focus is solely on y'all, and I'm not going to be making any plans until you finish high school for sure. And interestingly enough, the two of them decided to create an eHarmony profile for me. And 6 months was just of nothing, In fact, I was not even going to renew my subscription, but I kept getting this they send you hints or reminders and said, Tim from Thomasville wants to meet you. And so I thought, well, at least it's, it's close enough by, but it's far enough away that if I need to get away from it, it won't be a big deal. So I responded to that request. I met Tim from Thomasville, and the rest is history. And so I ended up moving here to be with Tim and his sons in 2012.
So you ended up inheriting quite a family. So you had 2 daughters and 3 boys when you married Tim Mitchum.
That's right. We tease and say we were only Cindy short of the Brady Bunch. So...
Yes, that is so true. Well, and he's really good with our sound, I know, at the church. So, Tim, don't critique this podcast too much when you hear the sound.
That's great. Yes, he says he has found his place of service. He is very much an introvert, opposite of my personality, but he really enjoys being a part of that AV team. So, we're glad that he's serving there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Elizabeth, you mentioned it. You mentioned you went through a painful divorce, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and start getting into your story. So will you just start by telling me what happened?
Sure. It's just a little bit of background. I returned to Perry several years after graduating from college. I worked in Atlanta and just really kind of got tired of that rat race. And honestly, I was not living out my faith as I should have been. I was certainly saved, a born-again believer, but I was not connected in a personal way to God. And so I was struggling. I was struggling with singleness and figuring out, really longing for community and relationships. And I felt like a move back home, back to a familiar place would be helpful to me. Not soon after I made that move back, I actually met my future husband. He had come to Middle Georgia as a banker. He was originally from the coastal area of Georgia, and was just a delightful person. We got to be friends. We were very involved in our church and in our community together. And after a couple of years, a romance blossomed, and I really believed that I was in love with him and that he was in love with me and that we had a very bright future. I also recognize a little insistence on my part that I was at that point in my life. I was 26 years old. I was ready to be married and settle down and have a home and start a family. And so
were you feeling maybe a little bit of pressure to go ahead and take that step and get married?
Yes, I think we both were. I think we both were, for different reasons, were feeling that. Yes. So we did, and we married in 1990, and within 4 years we had 2 children. Our first daughter was born in 91, and then Claire was born in 94. And we had a good life. He was doing very well in his career. We bought a small business, which I operated and managed on a daily basis. We had the support of family. My parents were in town. His parents were close by. It was a really good situation. And one thing I mentioned to you earlier, I think we all, wherever we are in our lives, we get used to a certain sense of normal. One thing that was always a struggle for me in my marriage was I never felt that I could make my husband happy. I'm a type 2 on the Enneagram, so that's a helper and a fixer, and always wanting to make sure that there's peace and that people are happy and satisfied. But I never felt like that I could do that for my husband. I mean, we could be companions and we could accomplish things together, but there was clearly something that was missing in our lives that, was bringing true happiness to us.
So early on, there was something you felt was missing, but you couldn't put your finger on it at the time?
Right. And I would ask a lot of questions, and I would, try to find ways of remedying that. I'd try to keep a perfect home, and I would try to make sure that our children behaved and did really well in school. So, I was always managing the situation, and then the results, I was still finding myself very disappointed in the results.
Yeah, so you were trying to keep everything perfect, and maybe that came from being in a military background too.
I think that may have been some of it, but I also just, it was really important to me to keep up appearances, and I saw where, my husband he had a difficult time making friendships, particularly with other men, and I had a wide web of friends, having grown up in the community and owning a business, and so that was, I was just always trying to manage things and trying to make the situation better for us. And then in 2002, he was offered a promotion and a transfer with the bank that he was working for. He'd always had a goal of very much an A personality, and always had the goal of being a bank president before he was 40. That was back in the day where community banking was still a big thing, not so much like it is now. And so it was a very hard decision for us to make. I didn't see the benefit in the move that he saw, but it was also, for me, well, maybe this will be the thing that will make him happy and bring happiness to our home. So we did make that move. It was very hard on me. It was hard on our daughters. But fortunately, we were able to soon connect with a church there. We met a lovely group of people that I'm still friends with many of. And so it seemed initially like it was going to be okay.
So that was a physical move from Perry to another place.
Right. It was, and
a move up the ladder, I take it.
Correct.
Okay.
So it was both of those things. But it was costly in other ways, more than just leaving our family and our familiar community. Like I said, we'd had this business for 10 years. You've had some business ownership experience, and it takes a lot of investment before you start seeing return. And we were beginning to see return, and then we're faced with having to sell that business. We're never going to get what you really have put into a business when you sell it. So that was costly to us, financially and emotionally. And but like I said, we felt like it was what we needed to do at the time. within 6 months of us making that move, we moved right at the end of the school year, and by October, my husband was dealing with just tremendous depression. He would come home from work, and he was in a very dark place. It just affected everything about him. It affected his appetite and his desire to do things and to participate in our family. And again, I went into fix-it mode. How can I fix this? Unbeknownst to me, this spiraled into dependence on prescription drugs that he was not getting in an ethical way. And so the situation got much worse before it got better. And he was very withdrawn from me, from our children. He would have moments that he could connect, but it was a really, really dark time.
Were you aware at that time that he was dependent on prescription drugs?
I was not aware. I knew something was going on. I knew he was more distracted and distant than he had ever been. I guess I just didn't have enough knowledge of that at the time to really know what was going on. But within a very short time, all the pieces came together. And like I said, that started in the fall. And then in April of the following year, I came home on Easter Sunday from church, and we were in separate cars, and he said he'd be around later. And I found an envelope left on my bathroom vanity, and unfortunately, it was a very cowardly way to explain everything that had been going on. And what he explained in that letter is that his depression, and he did not go into the drug use at this time, but the depression had come from a 6-month affair, and from the realization that he was living a lie, that he had decided, or had concluded, I guess I should say, that he was a homosexual and that he could no longer live the lie and be in an heterosexual marriage. So on one Sunday afternoon, it felt to me that my life just imploded. But also with that came, it's kind of weird to describe it this way, but there came a sense of relief that there were finally some answers for really looking back years of unknown.
That finally explained things, mm-hmm. Being able to look back and see right. Different behaviors and different changes, and not understanding why it was withdrawn and why you didn't have that happiness in your marriage. You
Absolutely.
Knew something was missing, but
Absolutely.
When you read that note on your bathroom counter, it just all made sense.
All those pieces came together.
Elizabeth, how did you respond at that time? Were you just in shock?
I was in shock. I was, I felt physically sick. I felt, my immediate response was, I've got to get myself together because I'm alone in my house with my 2 daughters, who at the time were 9 and 12. It's interesting when I think back, as distant as my husband had become in our marriage, he adored his daughters and they adored him. And up to that point, he had been a great father. And I think the biggest heartache of his life is that he couldn't do both. And so I was just, my mind was racing about how, but I remember, like, I don't know the noise, but I made an audible noise that caused them to come into that area. And so then, I'm trying to be very tender and to think how to manage this. And what I remember saying to them was, your dad has left me a note. I've got to talk to him before I really know and understand this. But he's saying he's going to leave our marriage. This has nothing to do with you. This is really hard. It's unexpected. All those things you're thinking to say. And I'm sure I didn't do everything exactly right, no doubt. But yes, it was devastating. It was a very dark time, but I've said this over and over again. I've never felt the presence of God more than I did on that day, and from that day forward. He was just very near to me.
Well, and first of all, I want to applaud you for talking to your girls, because you could have shut down and told them nothing.
Mm.
And I believe that when children can sense and they know they are so perceptive, they know so much more than we give them credit for.
Mm-hmm.
They will blame themselves for what's going on between mama and daddy.
Right.
And you explain things to them in a way that they could understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I know growing up in my family, that was one thing. We didn't have secrets in my family. We knew that my dad was an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that my mom didn't try to hide from us. I mean, she couldn't hide it from us.
It's very brave.
Yeah. So I think that's really good. And just, there could be parents out there now who are just thinking, do I tell my children what's going on? But again, the importance of that is helping that child realize this is not your fault.
Absolutely. And they need that assurance. They need the assurance of, no matter what's going on between mama and daddy, I love you, daddy loves you, and this is adult mess,
Mm-hmm.
and because I think to try to hide it from them, to try to pretend like nothing's wrong, is going to make the wound deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And they need the assurance, I think, more than anything, that you're going to be there for them. You're going to continue to love and protect them.
So you mentioned also that you felt God was so heavy there with you.
Right, absolutely.
Explain a little bit more about that. How did you know that?
I remember the first night, he did not come home that day. And I remember the first night, I just could not bring myself to sleep in our bedroom. And I had gotten the girls settled down, and I just curled up on the sofa. I don't think I slept a wink that night. I just remember just praying and talking to God and just feeling his assurance over me, that it was almost like, I've already mentioned that it was a relief, but it was also just that understanding that God knew all along. He knew all the secrets. He knew all the details that I still was very fuzzy on. And that just that assurance. And it was, I did not hear an audible voice, but I honestly felt a physical presence. I felt wrapped up in God's arms. And that is huge. And for anybody that's going through abandonment or estrangement or whatever, it is the loneliest thing, I think, that you can go through, a man or a woman.
Yeah.
And I would just say, cry out to God, because he is there and he is available to us.
Yeah. And immediately while you were saying that, I was thinking of that scripture that talks about the Lord your maker is your husband.
Yes.
And that's so hard to understand, but I think you were finding out something that it's one thing to find out that your husband's been having a heterosexual affair, but then another thing to find out that it's homosexual. And where does that leave you as a woman?
Yeah. Very devastated, questioning everything, wondering how I could possibly not have seen the handwriting on the wall, not been able to figure these things out. And so there was a lot of I don't want to say self-hate, but really questioning myself. How could I have been blind or dumb to what was going on right in front of me? I will say this, that not only was God there for me, but he put people in my life to just love me so well and to just help lead me out of this very dark pit that I felt like I was in. People who spoke truth in my life. It was an interesting circumstance in that the pastor I had grown up with in Perry as my youth pastor was at this very time serving in this community as a senior pastor at another church. He got word that this had happened. He came over, and I called him to see if he could come over, and he was such wise counsel for me. And I'll never forget the words he said to me. He said, "The spiritual head of your house has been cut off. But don't think for one moment that God won't serve in that place." And those words have just carried me and strengthened me and helped me realize, I'm the head of this house in more than one way right now.
Yeah.
And I need God to help me fulfill that role.
Yeah. And as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Absolutely.
So God was right there beside you.
Yes.
But you were having to take on some leadership roles that normally your husband would have been doing.
That's right. After this it was a very, public thing. I have already mentioned my husband was a bank president, very well known.
So how
involved.
did people find out? Because I know when something like that happens, you're going to get your intimate group of friends and tell them, but you don't want it to go much further than that circle. But how did that?
And you assume you can keep something like this under wraps. But it was not, this happened on a Sunday. And by Monday morning, I had a friend call me and said, she said, I just left the preschool drop off and this is what I was told. And I could not believe it. I could not believe that the word was already, but what was the truth, Angie, is that were people in the community that knew what was going on with the affair that I did not know. And so them coming to their wives and saying, here's what's been going on for 6 months. There were people who already knew that, and this just confirmed it.
So when you look back at that, I'm just thinking if there were somebody that we knew, that we saw that their spouse was being unfaithful, would you have appreciated it if somebody had come to you in confidence and said, Elizabeth, this is what I've observed. I'm sorry to have to tell you this. Or do you think we should just mind our own business and not say anything? I
would have appreciated it so much because I really was, I thought my husband was dealing with mental illness struggles. And he was depressed because he was living a double life. I'm not saying he wasn't having true symptoms of depression, but I would have been so grateful. I mean, it was hurtful to me when people came to me after the fact and said, well, I had seen them places or I had been suspect of this. And I was like, why did you not say something to me? I mean, because I was not aware of some of the things that other people were aware of. I was just trying to keep my head above water, So that being said, that's a hard thing to do, but having lived through that, I hope that if I were in a place and I had actual knowledge, that I would have the confidence to go to someone else and share my concerns at least.
Right, and share it with love and graciousness.
Right. Absolutely.
Did he end up coming back after that Easter Sunday?
Yes, surprisingly so. Not only was my family impacted, but the person that he'd been in a relationship with was the father of 4 boys, and so that family was tremendously impacted. And so I don't really know what happened, but I think the two of them, after making this bold proclamation on Easter Sunday, I think when they realized the collateral damage, it didn't take long to see how their families were being affected. They, part of me says they came to their senses, but that's not really what happened. But actually by the next day, my husband was calling and saying, can we just talk? And I desperately wanted to talk. I didn't want to find this information out in a letter. And so he did come back. And, there was I had to put some real strict ground rules in place right off the bat. Another repercussion of this was because it became public so quickly, he lost his job. So not only were we reeling from him abandoning our marriage and family, he lost the very thing that brought us to this community. I felt cursed, I was like just terrified of what the future held. And so what I said to him was, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what this looks like. This is going to be a long road to reconciliation. But what I do know is that I need to get my children back to the place that is home to them. We need to back to Perry, back to the school they had been enrolled in. I was just thinking what would be the safest place for them at the time. We were very close to the end of the school year, and I knew we wouldn't do anything, but I was already putting those plans in place, and I said, this is how I'm moving forward, and we can figure the rest out. Long story short, though, he was very remorseful. One thing that he was not was repentant. I kept thinking that really bothered me. I mean, he was sorry. What he thought he was going into had collapsed. So, I guess coming back home made the most sense to him. He worked very, very hard to try to put things back together. And he actually ended up with a great job in Middle Georgia. And so we decided for the time being we would move back as a family. We would seek counseling, and we would see where it went. So we did that, and we ended up struggling and trying for about 2.5, 3 more years before the final decision that what we were doing was not healthy for anybody.
Did it ever come out, did he ever say that he had had these struggles for many years and that he thought by getting married it would fix him?
Absolutely. He, after this all came to light, he went back and said even as a 11 or 12-year-old boy, he had been molested by an older teenager. And it had never, his mother actually saw it and just made the older teenager leave, swept it totally under the rug. It was never dealt with. It was never, I think more than anything, it was just treated with a lot of shame. We're not going to talk about this. And so we all know what that does to a boy at a very impressionable age. He had some experience, dabbled, I think, in some experiences in college, but from that point on, nothing. And, he said, I wanted to honor God. I wanted to do well in my career. I wanted to have a family. I mentioned what a great dad he was, and he really was. But he just, he had struggled with it for a long time, and he thought that just by taking the next right step that it would just all kind of resolve itself.
Yeah. So really, though, it went deeper than just waking up one day and saying, I believe I'm homosexual.
Correct. He
had an incident that occurred that affected him at a very vulnerable age.
Yes.
And it got swept under the rug. And that was how people used to deal with things back then. Right. So I think we have come a long way in getting people help when things happen that are detrimentally effective to them. So
right.
Maybe if that had been dealt with in a different way, he wouldn't have had so many struggles.
Right.
I don't know.
You don't know. You really don't know. And it, hearing those things broke my heart.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a person that I loved and I cared for, and I was really sad to hear that, and just, all I could help think, but God help me if something like that would ever happen to my children, that I would deal with it appropriately, because here we are 30 years down the road, and the damage is just now coming to a head.
So during that 2.5 to 3 year period when you guys were going through counseling and you were trying to make things work,
right,
did you have glimmers of hope that things were going to work out, or could you see the writing on the wall, so to speak, that this just may not work out?
Initially, I did have hope. I felt like he was trying really hard and really investing in our relationship, but it didn't take long for me to realize. I mean, just things started creeping up. Like, I think the first counselor we saw, even though the shingle said Christian counselor, was the first advice she gave is that everyone has to live their own truth. And I knew immediately, I'm like, that is not what God's word says. That the only truth we have is Jesus Christ. And so that was really difficult. And then she really encouraged my husband to get individual counseling, which I agreed that he needed, but I also felt very shut off from that. So I think, sometimes I think that the individual counseling he got really was more detrimental to our relationship, because it did help him embrace the truth of his life, with what he accepted as the truth of his life. So, it was a struggle. It was a struggle.
One thing that I haven't really heard you mention is just, did you forgive him immediately, or was that a process?
That's definitely a process. And I'll be honest, full forgiveness for me did not come until after the divorce. I've written in my story that forgiveness was like 2 steps forward and 1 step back for a long, long time. And when I got to the point that I realized this anger and bitterness that was welling up in me was coming from that place of unforgiveness, I had to let it go, because number one, I was not modeling the right thing for my children. And number two, I could not be used for the Lord being stuck in that place of anger and bitterness. And I felt very justified
Oh, yeah.
in my anger and in my unforgiveness. I was thinking about, and it really made me think about this when I listened to your story on the Revealed podcast. I was at a Beth Moore conference while we were still in this kind of period of reconciliation. And I don't remember what she was preaching about or what passage scripture she was using, but I remember so clearly her saying, when we're going through the process of forgiveness, don't think that every situation of forgiveness leads to reconciliation. And I was really confusing that in my life. I was thinking that if I forgive my husband, then we're automatically going to be reconciled and everything's going to be okay. I can't tell you what freedom I found in accepting that truth and accepting God's truth over my life as saying, you are free to give this up. I want you to depend on me. I want you to trust in me. Not for 1 minute do I think that God approves of divorce. The Bible says he hates divorce. And I think if living in our culture, we see the damage that it causes to families and to children and to culture itself. But I also believe that God does not intend us to be dependent on relationships that are so badly broken.
Yeah.
And that can be physical, emotional, spiritual, whatever.
Right. Yeah. And I think too that when we are in a situation where we could be in harm, whether that be mentally or physically, I know that I have prayed and prayed for marriages to be restored.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, it comes down to 2 people, and 2 people who have choice.
Right.
You have no control over that spouse, and that spouse has no control over you.
Mm-hmm.
But where you do have control is over yourself. And you can choose to let God make changes in your heart. And if that other person chooses to let God make changes in their heart, hallelujah, things can be restored.
Right.
But if that person says no, there's not a whole lot you can do about that.
Right. You said that very well, and that is where I found myself. And I found myself in a place where God was challenging me, saying, do you trust me? Do you trust me to be a single parent and provide for you? Do you trust me to feel you emotionally? You mentioned, do you trust me to be the husband, that you have really emotionally and spiritually lost, and that's what it came down to for me. And you are exactly right. It takes 2 very repentant hearts that are willing to work through the most difficult of situations. And there are situations when people are able to do that, and I praise God for it.
Absolutely.
But there are situations where that's just not possible.
Yeah. And I think that so many people do see the shame and the guilt of divorce. As you mentioned, one of your bigger concerns was just the shame of the divorce coming out.
Right.
And you weren't even looking at what had gone on with your husband.
Mm-hmm.
It was more that shame of that divorce.
Right.
And any person who's out there, who's feeling that guilt, who's feeling that shame, God does not put guilt and shame on you.
No.
And the reason that he hates divorce is he sees how it hurts his children.
Mm-hmm.
That is my belief, is that he sees how it hurts his children, and he doesn't want us to be hurt.
Right.
And I think that's another reason why, you kind of mentioned at 26, you started feeling this pressure. Gosh, I need to go ahead and get married.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the reason God really wants us to wait on him.
Absolutely.
For the right spouse.
Right.
Or to be single, which is not always an easy choice.
Sure.
But just, as you said, really putting our trust in the Lord for who he's going to bring into our lives, instead of feeling that pressure from society that at 26 years old, if you don't go ahead and get married, you're never going to have kids. No, you can't listen to that.
No, that's absolutely right. And, I've thought long and hard about, I don't regret my marriage, my first marriage, because it gave me my two incredible daughters. And they're as much their dad's DNA as they are mine. And they are, they are gifted and driven and smart and talented. And I'm so thankful for them. So I can't look back and say, I had regrets. God takes our planning when we get ahead of him, and he still can use it for good.
Yeah.
But he, our marriage was not able to be redeemed because we were in very different places, and we needed to be apart to be able to be healthy individuals.
When did you finally realize this just is not going to work?
It was, we were, like I said, back in Middle Georgia. I guess by this time, both girls were in middle school. Lauren may have been even in high school. And he was going through that withdrawn period again, the same thing that I had seen prior to him revealing to me what the struggle was. But this time I refused to try to be the hands-on fixer. I just very directly went to him and said, look, our family can't survive this again. Where are you? What are you feeling? I know you've tried really hard. I know that I haven't fully forgiven you. I don't know that I'll ever trust you again. I wanted to assume my part of the responsibility in this too. And he just said, I'm just so torn. I want to have a family. I want to be the father to these children that they deserve. But I continue to struggle with these same-sex feelings. And I said, it broke my heart. It's not what I wanted to hear. But I said, I respect that, and I think we need to move forward. You need to get on with your life. I need to get on with my life, and we'll figure this out. And so that's what we did. And at that, we were separated for this actually happened probably in January, and I'm thinking that we were separated and living in two separate places for about 9 months before the divorce was final. And that was it. And again, it was a period of relief for me to know that I really felt like I had done all I could do, and I felt release to be able to walk away from it at that time.
How were your girls doing during that time?
I can remember telling them, I sat down and I told them, and they both said to me, I'm so glad y'all finally reached this decision. I could not believe it. Because they just sensed, they knew that we were not together as a family, and that I would be better off and that they would be better off to get out from under the stress that we were living in. They were sad, don't get me wrong. It's not like they rejoiced, but it was a huge relief for them too. And then I had the guilt of, I should have done this, 2 years ago. And once again, I think God's timing is perfect. Because of their ages at that time, they both were over 13. I didn't have to have a shared custody agreement. Visitation was up to them and their schedules. So there were some things that, because we waited, I think really came out in our favor.
Well, God is so faithful in those things. And I go back to that day when you had gotten that note, and you could have just fallen apart on the floor, which I know you did, but you gathered yourself enough together to tell the girls, this is not about you.
Right.
These are problems your father and I are having. And I think just setting that precedent that early on was so wise, Elizabeth, because that to me shows me that by the time you guys had tried everything you could, they realized that the struggle that was in the home was just causing distress for everybody.
Absolutely. It was. And it didn't come without more struggle, once we were separated and finally divorced. You have to navigate those visits and what a relationship with Dad is going to look like. One thing I think to his credit is that he realized when they grew beyond being little girls, he really didn't know how to parent them, and he was scared to parent them. And I think he was just afraid he would bring more damage in their lives. So, we did have to work through a lot of things. Single parenting 2 teenagers is not easy, and I certainly didn't do everything perfect or even well at times. But I did learn to I had to depend on my strength coming from the Lord. That's for certain.
How did your heart mend?
Gosh, that's a great question. God really did a work in me. Like I said, the relief and the freedom and just knowing that I didn't have to try to live under the stress of that anymore was huge. That was a huge part. I think the greater part was forgiveness, when it really and finally came. And that was taking that deep look inside and saying, you are a wreck because of this unforgiveness. And I've heard the adage that unforgiveness is like drinking gasoline and thinking it's going to kill the other person. That's not the way it works. It is destroying you. And I was able to recognize that. That was a huge turning point for me, just to finally get all that anger out, to say everything I had to say, and then start forgiving. And then, when I mentioned the girls setting up this eHarmony profile for me, again, I was like, I don't even know if I can love somebody, And the person that I met was who I believe God intended for me all along.
That is so cool. I love hearing that, because you do look very happy, and I think he must feel the same way about you too.
Well, it's so interesting to be in a relationship, and I have felt this way about Tim just about since the first time I met him, to feel adored. Because for 13 years, I did not feel adored. For 13 years, I felt like I couldn't do enough to even be liked, and so it is such a beautiful gift that God has given me. And Tim had gone through heartache too. I mean, he was a widower, and he became a widower in 2007, and he had 3 young boys, and so we had both been through some really difficult time, and it was just, Scripture says that God will restore the years that the locusts took away, and he truly has done that for us.
I believe that. And another scripture that came to mind as I was thinking about your story, I actually keep this one in my bathroom, but it says, look out after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. And I just see that in your life, that you made that choice, that forgiveness was going to be part of you moving forward. Absolutely. And that you weren't going to let a bitter root take place in your heart that would have affected your girls, and it would have affected a relationship with a future husband you didn't even know was out there.
Right. That's very true. And it was, I don't say that, I hope it doesn't come across as selfish, but for anybody that's dealing with unforgiveness, you've got to let that go. You've
Yeah.
got to let that go to really go forward and be that all God has called you to be.
Yeah, because really, you're not, as you said, given that analogy of, drinking the gasoline, it's really poisoning you.
Absolutely.
It's not, you're not doing anything to hurt that other person.
Sure.
You're poisoning yourself.
Right.
And others in your realm.
That's so true.
Well, I love happy endings, and I am so glad that everything has turned out so well for you, and you are just a blessing for so many people, and I know that people are going to be blessed by hearing your story, and I want to encourage anybody out there who may be struggling with anything similar to what Elizabeth has discussed today, that you can contact me at Angie@revealedpodcast.org. And if you want to get in touch with Elizabeth, if you're dealing with some things that she's been through and you want to talk to her, contact me at that email address and we'll get you hooked up with her. And I would love for you guys to go on our social media sites at Revealed Podcast is where you can find us on Facebook, and Revealed Story on Instagram. And we hope that this podcast has been a blessing.